So as some of you know, I'm currently trying to write a book on the right against. It used to be about the right to mental integrity. Now I changed the title so it refers to the right against mental interference because I want to focus on the purely negative part of this right. I think some people think that both bodily and mental integrity have some more positive aspects as well, but I'm just going to I just try to focus on the negative aspects, which I call the right against bodily interference in the bodily case and mental interference in the mental case. And the idea for the book was to kind of start with the better understood and better accepted right against bodily interference, and then kind of see how far we can get in defending a mental analog of that right, so a right against mental interference. But one thing that I've discovered in the course of trying to write the book is that the right against bodily interference isn't as good a starting point as I thought it was, because there's it's also not that well understood. There's lots of disagreement about exactly what falls under the scope of this right, as we've been talking about this morning. And I think that's especially true if you're understanding it as a moral right rather than as a legal right, which I want to do. So I decided, I need to come up with my own kind of account of the right against bodily interference as well. And this paper is kind of my first attempt to try to make some progress on that. So I'm basically interested in the question, which interventions infringe the right against bodily interference, assuming that we possess such a right. And infringements, I take it that infringements of this right might still be justified, all things considered, but if your right against bodily interference is infringed, then you're wronged in some way and there need to be some strong justification. And what I'm trying to do is here in this talk is just try to kind of capture the right against bodily interference that I think is kind of implicit in common sense moral thinking, rather than trying to give some more kind of theoretically motivated account or something like that. Some terminology to begin with. I'm going to infringements of the right against bodily interference. I'm not sure if this is true in law as well, but in ethics, they're sometimes referred to as cases of bodily trespass. It's especially true, I think, when people are thinking of this right against bodily interference as an element of a property right over the body. I'm going to use that terminology just because it will be convenient here, but I'm not, in using that terminology, I'm not wanting to assume that there is a property right of the body and that this right against bodily interference is part of that property right, although I do actually think that's quite plausible. So adopting that terminology, then my question is the question on the title on the handout, what does it take to trespass on a person's body? Now, what I want to do is to start by trying to give a kind of very minimal and ecumenical account of bodily trespass. So I want to kind of give an account that captures hopefully the uncontroversial cases where most people would kind of agree this is a bodily trespass, an infringement of the right against bodily interference. And then in the last couple of minutes, I want to sort of offer some comments on whether and how we might want to extend that account into some more controversial terrain. So to start with, let me kind of posit an initial account of bodily trespass, which is quite similar to one that Joe mentioned in his talk earlier. So let's say that A trespasses on B's body if without B's consent or forfeiture, A foreseeably touches B's body with A's own body or with an object that A controls. So by without B's consent or forfeiture, I mean here without B having validly consented to the intervention, and also without B having forfeited the relevant aspect of the right. So I take it that it's at least a kind of conceptual possibility that you can forfeit parts of your or aspects of your right against bodily interference. So if I attack Brian on the street and he grabs hold of my arm to restrain me, he's interfering with my body in a way that would ordinarily infringe my right against bodily interference, but because he's acting in self-defense and I've attacked him, maybe we can say that I've forfeited my right against bodily interference, or at least the part of it that Brian's action would otherwise infringe, so that it's no longer infringed in this case. So that's my starting point. So basically the idea to begin with is to think of cases of bodily touching without consent and without the right having been forfeited. Those would be cases of bodily trespass, and I think that account does accommodate most of the standard instances, like violently or sexually assaulting someone or performing a surgical procedure on someone without their consent. Those are interventions that all involve foreseeable touching of the sort that's captured by this account. But I don't think that this account covers all of the kinds of interventions that we might want it to cover. So consider the toothpick example on the handout. I insert a toothpick 1 centimeter into your nostril without touching your skin, your nose hairs, or your nasal mucosa. Sorry for all the details. I think that this is not a case of touching, but it looks like plausible, somewhat plausible to me that we might want to call this a case of bodily trespass. Now, I'm not actually sure really what I think about that case. I'd be curious to hear what other people think about it, and also what the lawyers say about what the law would say about it. But I'm just going to set that aside, and I'm not going to try and accommodate that case within my account because I'm not quite sure what I think about it. But let me move on to some cases where I think it's clearer that we would want our account of bodily interference and bodily trespass to accommodate the case. So consider the radiation burns example on the handout. Suppose that Aroha causes Bram to suffer radiation burns by exposing him to high energy electromagnetic radiation. I think that this case fairly counts as bodily interference, bodily trespass, but it doesn't seem to involve touching of any sort. And maybe you could kind of accommodate this case by giving some very revisionary understanding of what touching involves. That could include touching someone with electromagnetic radiation or with particles or rays or something like that. But I think there are other cases, similar cases, that would be even more difficult to kind of accommodate within an account of touching. So consider the oxygen deprivation case. Cressida sucks most of the oxygen out of Dan's bedroom while he's sleeping, thus intentionally causing him to suffer hypoxic damage to many of his organs. It seems to me that Cressida has interfered with Dan's body and has infringed his right against bodily interference. But I think it would take some very kind of fancy footwork to make that come out as a case of touching. Okay, so we might wonder, by virtue of what does Cressida trespass on Dan's body? So one suggestion might be that she does so by causing him to suffer bodily harm. And I think plausibly it seems like there is harm in this case, and also in the radiation burns case. But I don't think that this harm is essential to the trespass, and I think we can see this by considering another case, the beneficial oxygen deprivation case. So suppose that Farhad suffers from a condition of having too much oxygen in his blood that's causing damage to his organs. Edith then sucks much of the oxygen out of Farhad's bedroom as he sleeps, thereby correcting this damage. So here it seems to me, at least if it's the case that Edith could have got Farhad's consent for doing this, it wasn't like an emergency setting where she had to perform this action and there was no opportunity to gain consent. Suppose that she could have got his consent and she just chose not to and to go ahead without his consent. I think we want to say that there's a case of bodily interference, and as I'm using the term bodily trespass in this case, but there's no harm. Okay, so why is there trespass or interference in this case then? So my suggestion is that we need to allow that someone can trespass on someone else's body just by foreseeably altering their bodily states, at least in certain kinds of ways. Now, there are lots of questions you might be worried about here that we would need to answer. First of all, what does it take? What counts as altering someone's bodily states? Are we interested in changing someone's bodily states compared to what they were before your action? So a temporal understanding of alteration. Or are we interested in changing someone's bodily states compared to what they would have been in the absence of the action or the intervention? So that would be a kind of counterfactual understanding of alteration. There's a question about whether we want to limit ourselves to cases of causing an alteration to someone's bodily states, or whether we also want to include cases of allowing an alteration. I'm going to set those questions aside and just focus on the most uncontroversial cases where you're causing an alteration, and in both the temporal and the counterfactual. There's still a further question though about exactly which alterations count as bodily interference and as trespasses on the body, because I don't think it's very plausible that all cases count. So first of all, there seem to be some kinds of ways of altering someone's bodily states that just seem to involve an alteration that's too minor in sort of magnitude or severity to infringe any rights, to count as a bodily trespass. So consider the arm hairs case. I wave my hand near your arm and cause some of your arm hairs to quiver in the I'm altering some of your bodily states. I think it's plausible to say I'm interfering with your body in a very minor way, but I don't think we'd say in this case that I'm infringing your right against bodily interference or trespassing on your body. So I want to suggest that there needs to be something like a significance threshold, understood in terms of the severity or magnitude of the alteration. But then there's a further question that arises, because it seems like not all different ways of causing alterations to someone's bodily states count as bodily interferences and as trespasses. So I'm going to skip a couple of cases here on the handout and go straight to the lion warning case. So third of the way down the second column. So suppose that Ingrid wants Jarvis to experience an elevation in his stress hormone levels. Because I've got some of my pronouns wrong here because I changed the people in the case, but because she knows that there's a lion on the loose in the neighborhood, and that Jarvis needs to be vigilant and ready to run to safety. So she wants him to have a high adrenaline level so he's ready to escape. Now, how does she do this? Well, she truthfully tells him about the lion and his stress hormones indeed spike. So this seems to be a case of foreseeably altering someone's bodily states. Seems to me like a significant alteration that's being caused, but we wouldn't normally call this a case of bodily interference or a case of bodily trespass. So it seems like we need some limitation on the different means of altering someone's bodily states that we count as bodily interferences and bodily trespasses. So what should that limitation be? Well, I mean, I think the initial and maybe the obvious suggestion, and I think this fits with some things that people talk about when they're talking about trespass on property as well, like trespass on chattels, for example. Some people think interference, for it to amount to trespass, has to be of a kind of physical kind. So it has to be, and the way I would understand that in this case is that the bodily alteration has to be caused by purely physical processes, not psychological processes within the target, the person who's being interfered with. So the thought would be that lion warning doesn't count as a case of bodily trespass because Jarvis's bodily states are being alterated in part through a psychological process within him. So if we go for that kind of a limitation, then we might end up with something like the revised account on the handout. So A trespasses on B's body if, without B's consent or forfeiture, A either foreseeably touches B's body with A's own body or with an object that A controls. So that's just from the preliminary account. And now I'm adding in a second kind of bodily interference and bodily trespass, which is foreseably, comma missing, there should be a comma there, foreseably, significantly, and via non-psychological means altering B's bodily states. So this is my kind of, I think this is kind of where I've got to in terms of thinking this is a kind of fairly safe account of bodily trespass. I think most of the interventions that this count captures are plausibly bodily interferences or cases of bodily trespass. I kind of want to take this as my starting point, at least for thinking further about bodily trespass. But I just want to end by raising a couple of issues about this account, which I think raise some complications. So I think there are some cases that we might want to say constitute bodily trespasses that aren't captured by this account. Now, I don't think they're sort of uncontroversial cases, but I think they're cases where it's at least somewhat plausible to say this is an instance of bodily trespass. So consider the flashing lights case on the slide. Kira wants Lex to experience an epileptic seizure, and she achieves this by exposing him to flashing lights. Or consider the subliminal maggots case. Mana wants Nola to retch, and she causes him to do this by setting his television to display subliminal images of maggot-infested food. So these are cases that I think it's not completely counterintuitive to describe as cases of bodily interference. But more importantly, I think they're cases where it's kind of hard to see any morally significant difference between them and similar cases that clearly would involve bodily interference or bodily trespass. So I think it's hard to see what's the morally significant difference between the flashing lights case and, say, causing someone to experience a seizure by magnetically or electrically stimulating their brain non-invasively. Hard to see any moral difference between those things. The brain stimulation case would clearly, on my revised account, count as a bodily trespass. So why shouldn't the flashing lights case? And similar with the subliminal maggots case. Suppose you could produce this retching by some magnetic or electrical brain stimulation procedure. I think we'd want to say it's bodily trespass. And I think it's hard to see any significant difference between that kind of case and the subliminal maggots case. So I think these kinds of cases create a challenge. And that they suggest that we need to allow within our account of bodily trespass some cases of bodily alterations that are kind of psychologically mediated, that are produced via psychological processes. And yeah, there are different ways that we could go here. I mean, the further revised account on the handout is my preferred way of going, which is to draw a distinction between whether the psychological processes being invoked are reasons-sensitive processes or not. So I think that maybe we can include the flashing lights cases and the subliminal maggots cases within the account of bodily trespass if we change the non-psychological means condition to a reasons and sensitive means condition. So I think it's plausible to say that the means via which the epileptic seizure and flashing lights is produced and the retching and subliminal maggots are produced, those are not reason-sensitive processes, even though they are psychological processes. Perception is involved. In the subliminal maggots case, something like subconscious disgust associations are invoked. I take those to be mental processes or psychological processes, but they're not reason-sensitive processes. So maybe we can use that kind of distinction to help here. But I think the issue is that basically, whatever approach we go for, whether you like my further revised account or think there's a different account that we should go for, I think we're going to face a kind of dilemma, which is that it seems to me very difficult to come up with an account that's going to include cases like flashing lights and subliminal maggots, but not also include lots of cases of things that don't seem very intuitively objectionable and don't seem like cases of parents or bodily trespass. So it's wearing perfume on a date to try to get your date with the intention, or at least with the foreseeable implication that your date experiences an endorphin rush of attraction or something. There's a physical alteration. It's a significant physical alteration. We wouldn't normally say that when you wear perfume on a date, you're trespassing on a person's body. I think probably my revised accounts would say that we do have to include that as a case of bodily trespass. So the dilemma, I think, is that we either end up with this very inclusive account, which includes lots of stuff that we wouldn't normally think of as bodily interference or bodily trespass, or we could just stick with something like my revised accounts, a narrow account, which I don't think has counterintuitive implications, or at least it's not counterintuitively inclusive. But I think it just sort of seems to have arbitrary boundaries. It's not clear why we should specifically care about the fact that something was produced via a physical, not psychological process, especially if the comparative, especially if we think about cases like flashing lights and subliminal maggots, where the psychological processes involved, aren't rational processes or autonomous thought or anything like that. It's not clear why the inclusion of those psychological elements should be making any moral difference. So that's the dilemma. Either it seems like bodily trespass is a much broader category than we commonly think, or we go for this narrow approach, in which case it seems like it has kind of morally arbitrary boundaries. So I'm hoping that someone here will be able to help me out with getting out of this dilemma. Thanks.